Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on working with homeless shelters to house survivors of human trafficking. We're very excited to be able to bring this topic to all of you. We know it's something that's very important for everyone, and we have gotten a great response. And so just to make everyone aware, there is a lot of participation, and there are a lot of attendees on this webinar. So everyone is currently muted, and it will be remaining muted throughout the entirety of the webinar. However, we are going to show you a couple of ways for you to interact and ask questions and also add comments throughout. So you're going to see at the bottom of your screen a bar that has a chat, a raise hand, and a closed captioning box. And for all of those, they're going to allow you to do a number of different things. For the chat box, we'll be using this for you to ask questions or make comments throughout the entire presentation. For the raise hand feature, that's really to get kind of a quick feedback from participants. So let's go ahead and try out the raise hand feature. If you just click on your hand, we just want to make sure that everyone sees where that's at. And okay, perfect. So yeah, we see a lot of hands going up. So everyone's finding that raise hand feature. So that basically allows us to know and get that quick feedback like I mentioned. So thank you for raising your hand. And then finally, you're going to see your closed captioning, which says CC. That's going to allow you to get closed captioning through throughout the webinar, and it'll pop up right on your screen. And so feel free to click on that if that's something that you would like to have. Throughout the chat, we would love to hear from you as far as any questions or comments that you have. If you send a chat to all panelists and attendees, it allows everyone to see your comments or questions, and we would love to be able to make sure that everyone on the webinar is able to see it. So please make sure to, if you're comfortable, to use that option of talking to all panelists and attendees, especially because a lot of the people on the webinar may have very similar questions, or if you're sharing something that has been useful in your community or your state or your city, it would be really beneficial for other people to also hear a little bit about what you all are working with. So we're going to go ahead and test out the chat box. If you could just type into the chat box where you're joining from. So tell us what city and state, and also what your weather is like there. So we're based out of DC, and we are having very muggy weather in the 90s. Maybe some rain, maybe not, but it's muggy. So it looks like, yeah, North Dakota, Ohio's, well, I was gonna say Ohio seemed to be rainy. New York is cold and rainy. New Orleans hot, yes. We hear you. So it looked like one person had nice weather. So that's great. You know, hope you enjoy it for all of us. We'll be here in this muggy weather. So perfect. It looks like everyone's getting a good sense of the features, and we really encourage you to use these throughout. And some of them will be asking for your feedback during the chat box or through that chat box. And really, that's the best way for us to be able to engage, especially with so many people on the webinar. So we'll go ahead and move into our next section. For those of you that may not be familiar with the Freedom Network, we're a national coalition of service providers, survivors, and advocates addressing human trafficking through a rights-based approach. And so through our Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, we support service providers in the anti-trafficking field around access for housing for survivors of trafficking. So we work with experts in the field, such as service providers and survivors who have that lived experience, in order to inform the project and really draw on their expertise to deliver critical training and resources. So you're going to hear from a lot of the from those experts today. And some of the resources that we have available is through bi-monthly webinars, such as this one, in which we introduce different topics that may either be new topics or enhance the knowledge around housing resources that could be a good fit for survivors. So we know every survivor's experience is different and unique, and not one size fits all, not one resource fits everyone. However, the more that we know about what's currently in existence, the best that we'll be able to provide different options that could potentially be a good fit. We do have a number of fact sheets on different housing programs and systems that can help you navigate those resources. And those are located on our website, freedomnetworkusa.org. You'll find a resource library, which houses all of those resources for this project, as well as additional resources on serving survivors of trafficking. And for OVC grantees, that's the Office for Victims of Crime, we can provide 101 training or technical assistance, for housing on survivors of trafficking. So that's just a little bit about this project. Today we have 4 great speakers that we are just so thrilled to have and to share their expertise with us. Amy Fleischauer is the Director of Survivor Support Services at the International Institute of Buffalo, and she supervises a team of case managers and advocates, and they're working with nearly 500 survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence annually. She also serves as a project consultant for the USCRI Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, and she provides training and technical assistance for organizations administering direct care to foreign-born survivors of trafficking. Beth O'Neill is the program director at Florence House, and that's a partnership between Avesta Housing and Preble Street that provides emergency shelter, as well as supportive permanent housing for women experiencing homelessness in Portland, Maine. She brings to Florence House over 7 years of experience in empowering clients in low barrier shelter and housing first setting. Stephanie is a trauma specialist with 10 years of experience in crisis and conflict intervention. She currently serves as the director of Preble Street's anti-trafficking services, and she has developed conflict mediation courses for communities in Mexico, and as well as designed educational tools for cultural competency and assertive behavior in China. And she was most recently stationed in Israel as a sexual gender-based violence senior protection assistant with UNHCR. And finally, we have Somir Piriano Guzman, who's a senior program coordinator for the Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network at the International Rescue Committee in Seattle. He graduated from the University of California, San Diego with a master's in psychology, and he has years of experience developing curricula and providing training on trauma-informed care, mental health, and human trafficking. As a male survivor and as an expert in behavioral psychology, he has been an active consultant for the Department of Justice for the Office of Victims of Crime and is a subject matter expert. And additionally, he was appointed by President Barack Obama to the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. And he has also worked with the UN in Vital Voices in order to develop curricula on training and engaging men. So we're going to go ahead and move forward for the goals of this webinar. We really want you all as participants to hear about the low barrier models in the homeless shelter system, hear about what benefits and limitations may arise when housing a survivor of trafficking with a homeless shelter, and hear about some practical ideas on collaboration with homeless shelters. When you registered for this webinar, we had a question box in order for you to submit your questions that you may have of panelists. We did receive a lot of questions through that registration link, and so our panelists have received those, and they will be addressing them throughout their presentation. Because there were so many questions, we'll do our best to, again, include those and address them throughout the presentation, but we'll also have a question and answer portion at the end of the webinar, in which we'll also be taking some of those questions. That's also to say that if you have questions that arise throughout the different sections, please feel free to include them in the comment box and fill in the chat box. And if you feel more comfortable doing it just to panelists, that's fine. But if you share it with everyone, with panelists and attendees, again, it may allow others that may have similar questions. And finally, we just want to acknowledge that there is a lot of expertise with the panelists today. And also we know that there's a lot of expertise with attendees, with you all who are joining us. And so we really want to encourage you to share different resources or different ideas that are working well for you or that you're aware about because it's definitely beneficial for us, but also for other participants to hear about what's happening across the nation. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to hand it over to Amy, who's going to be talking about utilizing resources outside of the anti-trafficking field.
Hello, everyone. As Karen said, this is Amy from the International Institute of Buffalo, and I'm thrilled to present today. I wanted to start with a short story. I was hired to begin the first anti-trafficking response in Western New York back in 2006. And at that time, there were very few best practices. Certainly those best practices were only shared by mouth. There was nothing published. So there was really a feeling within our small field of just relying on each other and kind of making up a lot of it as we went along. I remember being really frustrated with that process at times and reaching out to a colleague who'd been doing the work about 3 years longer than I had. And I just said, you know, how do I solve this? It was a specific issue around resources and collaboration. And she said, I have the simplest and most challenging advice. Start having coffee with people. And I remember being really frustrated by that as well, because it wasn't a quick fix. But I think I really remembered that comment and conversation all this time and have found it to be true, and will really, I think, be the centralized theme of what I'm going to be talking about today when in building community collaborations around housing. Next slide, please. So before we launch into the next part, I just want to take a quick poll from our attendees, now reaching almost 250 people, which is so exciting. What types of shelters do you use? Do you refer survivors to within your community? And you'll see there's quite, you can obviously choose more than one. What type of shelters have you utilized in referring survivors to in your work? And I'll give everyone just a few more seconds to respond. I'm clicking away myself. Great, so as we see these results comes up, it really is all over the board. It looks like the highest numbers are domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters for both adults and family. Some communities are using, or are utilizing human trafficking shelters, faith-based shelters, and then a smaller percentage are using more specialized shelters, like those who accept LGBTQ populations, those for pregnant or parenting young women, maybe asylee or immigrant-specific shelters. So it really is all over the board. I wanted to ask this question, next slide please, because in just little Buffalo, New York, we actually have shelters, all of these types of shelters, and we have utilized all of them over time with various levels of success, and that's what I want to talk about. Because we have all those types of shelters and have had all those types of shelters since the beginning of our anti-trafficking program, our philosophy overall has always been, how can we possibly determine whether or not we need a trafficking-specific shelter or trafficking-specific beds if we are not fully familiar not only with the current resources, but familiar with their familiarity with human trafficking as an issue. So we have always felt, and this has been, and when I say we, I'm speaking for our organization, we have always felt that with shelter and any other resource, that our job was to connect with the community partners who are doing the most harm reductionist, the most trauma-informed, the most client-centered work And then we would talk to them about the issue of human trafficking and see, because our work here are grounded in those principles, that we would see how our work aligned. So that's really been our philosophy from the beginning. We serve approximately 275 to 350 on average survivors of human trafficking per year. And we do not believe, in fact, that we need a human trafficking specific shelter here in Western New York because of the relationships that we've been able to create with our housing partners. So as this slide points out, we are looking at not only the needs of the populations that we're already serving, the polyvictimization that is often untreated, and obviously their vulnerability, but also looking at the importance of building those relationships, because as I'm sure everyone on the call has seen, that most shelter programs, or most any organization, frankly, that are serving vulnerable populations or populations that have experienced a multitude of victimizations, that it's likely they're already serving survivors of human trafficking and perhaps not able to identify it because, again, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows, it's quite rare for survivors to self-identify. So when we're creating those relationships with our community partners and growing them, it's really beneficial to us both because we want to have trauma-informed, high-quality shelter options to refer survivors to, but we also want our community partners' assistance in identifying survivors within their own organization. So this leveraging of expertise and resources is helpful to survivors and really contingent on our ability as an organization to have an open mind and be patient and be proactive in our communication. Next slide, please. So obviously, and of course, even more so in recent years, being trauma-informed or client-centered is really a catchphrase that everybody likes to write on websites and make sure their brochures pointed out in their grant applications. So one of the things that is important to our organization when we're making, again, any referral, shelter or otherwise, is to do a little vetting and have some conversation about what does trauma-informed mean to that other organization. And of course, if we're vetting, we then need to, we needed to do some work in-house to talk about what does being trauma-informed look like in practice to us and our staff. So about 8 years ago, we went through a self-evaluation process around trauma-informed care and trauma-informed practices. It's something we actually do every other year with our full staff to ensure that we are grounded in our understanding of being trauma-informed in practice. And we created an informal kind of draft sheet that we keep in-house around what trauma-informed practices look like at our organization. We, of course, recognize that within our own case management work, and of course within the shelter system, that many policies and practices can be re-traumatizing, even if they are, of course, they don't mean to be, right? That rules in general can trigger clients who've been controlled. And so a lot of shelter programs have practices and policies that, again, inadvertently may trigger survivors of trafficking in ways that are different to other types of clients. And so what we do, part of our conversation when we're working with shelters, is to have that very direct conversation. Again, just a quick example, we recently, around how to kind of choose partners and talk to shelter programs, about 2 years ago, we started identifying a trend in which we were seeing, it wasn't a huge number, but it was certainly more than we'd ever seen before, of adult males in their in their 30s, I would say, who were survivors of labor trafficking they did not speak English, they were undocumented, and they were identifying as gay. And this was a population that has many challenges to be able to serve adequately, and certainly we strive to have a level of excellence in our services, but certainly around housing, there was a lot of challenges there. And so we approached the shelter that we had had a previous relationship with, and who we knew was trauma-informed and client-centered, and said, hey, we're seeing this. Are you willing to make things up as we go along with us? And to kind of walk through this together, to be in communication with this group of survivors to try out housing survivors with these challenges and needs and strengths, and involve them in creating some promising practices for shelter. And it literally just started there as a conversation. Next slide, please. The other thing that I think is an important lesson learned is that, again, we have many, many emergency shelter programs, and some organizations, some shelters, and frankly, other organizations in our area may not, in fact, align with our philosophy or our practice on client-centeredness or trauma-informed care. In my work nationally, I've seen this as well. I've heard examples, for instance, of shelter programs that automatically take clients' phones away when they walk through the doors, or the clients are mandated to attend a hygiene group in order to stay in shelter, or mandated to participate in a faith service in order to access shelter. So those types of policies would not, in fact, align with our definition of trauma-informed care. And yet, we also understand that our definition and our needs don't necessarily align with everything a survivor may want. So it's something I think that we have thought a lot about, and we know when we're thinking about our own rules about trauma-informed care, at the center of that is ensuring survivor choice. So just because an organization might not align with our philosophy or policies and procedures based in a human rights perspective, that doesn't mean that it might not be a good fit for a survivor. And it is our job, therefore, to know what all of those challenges or strengths might be for the different types of shelter options within our community, and to be transparent with survivors around what those might be. So, for example, we have worked with several survivors who were prevented from practicing their faith while they were being exploited. And so a faith-based community that mandated attendance at a service might not bother them at all, and in fact be exactly what they're looking for. So again, it's something that we don't get to determine fit. Our job as specialists in the human trafficking services field is to know all of our community resources and what they offer and what the criteria is and what life would look like if a survivor engaged in that service, and to present those options to a survivor during the needs assessment and service planning phases of our work with them. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. That was extremely helpful. And just to clarify, somebody had asked on the chat box if the International Institute of Buffalo serves both labor and sex trafficking survivors. And I believe it's a yes, but I just wanted to make sure you clarified.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm sorry I didn't see that question. We do. We serve all survivors of trafficking, regardless of type of exploitation. And I actually, before we move on, I just think that that's a really important point too, because one of our relationships with a local provider who does some minimal housing, but some housing work, they are experts in in sexual assault, and it's been a great collaboration because it's helped us actually more specifically talk to survivors of who identified as labor trafficking victims more about some of the sexual assault and exploitation they experienced during their exploitation. It's something we didn't necessarily anticipate when we approached them to collaborate, but again, I think another really good example of how approaching organizations with expertise different than yours in order to expand your own can only benefit survivors.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. Now we're going to hand it off to Preble Street. They're going to be talking about Housing First, especially from a perspective of a shelter and an anti-trafficking program.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Beth O'Neill, the Florence House Program Director.
And this is Stephanie Bratnick. I'm the Director of Anti-Trafficking Services at Preble Street.
Great, so we are gonna start off by first just kind of talking about the two models that we have here at Florence House and explaining them a little bit more. So I wanna first touch on Housing First and what it is. So Housing First is a recovery-oriented approach to ending homelessness that centers on targeting some of the most vulnerable people in our community. People experiencing homelessness, especially the folks that are experiencing chronic homelessness. And I'll get to the definition of chronic homelessness in a little bit. And it's getting them into independent, permanent housing, while also providing additional supports and services as needed. The Housing First model kind of first came about in the early 90s in New York through Pathways Through Housing. And we now see it being used widely and as a way to combat homelessness. And it works. And what I love about Housing First is that it's not contingent upon readiness or compliance. You know, for example, you have to be sober to get into housing. Rather, it's a rights-based intervention rooted in the philosophy that all people deserve housing. And, you know, it's proven that adequate housing is the precondition for recovery. So it's really that simple. The basic principle of Housing First is that people are better able to move forward with their lives if they're first housed. And it's truly amazing what can happen when folks have a sense of safety and security and can finally begin to heal from their trauma. So the name really says it all. Housing is provided first, and then individuals are able to begin to work on the other stuff, getting income, getting a PCP, case management, mental health support, education, employment, substance use, harm reduction, as well as making community connections. It's also important to stress that each service plan that we work on with our tenants is completely individualized and it's client driven. So in Housing First, tenants are driving the bus. At Preble Street's Housing First programs, we select tenants based on who are most vulnerable versus, you know, your next on the wait list. And to be able to do that, we've formed a committee, and you know, it's never easy. It's still a challenging process, but in my opinion, it's done the best way possible, and it's ensuring those super vulnerable folks are having a chance at housing. Each Preble Street Housing First tenant must meet the HUD definition of chronic homelessness, which I mentioned earlier. So that definition is 1 year consecutive or 4 incidents in 3 years, that up to a full year. So Florence House, the program I'm the director at, it's a pretty dynamic program. So we have those Housing First apartments upstairs, but on the shelter floor, we operate a low barrier homeless shelter. So what is low barrier? That gets thrown around quite a bit, right? So low barrier it's an adjective to use to describe a service provider or program that makes a delivery of service as accessible and user-friendly as possible. Low barrier programs try to minimize barriers that stand in the way of people getting their needs met. So for example, reducing paperwork, waiting lists, or eligibility requirements, or if substance use is a part of their lives. Low barrier programs are mindful of the ways in which both physical structures and staff approach the delivery of services. And, it starts right at the door. We also want to be mindful of like it definitely relates to being trauma informed as well. It's that first staff person you interact with walking through the door. It's the first person to pick up the phone when you're calling about trying to get a bed. We should also talk about what low barrier isn't. So low barrier does not mean no rules or no barriers. But when we do have rules and expectations, of course we have those. We just try to make sure they're not punitive. So yes, in short, safety and respect and a solid assessment of individual strengths and challenges is what goes on in a successful low barrier program. So real quickly too, on our shelter floor, we also have this model called Safe Havens. I just want to talk about quickly. So in addition to our 25 shelter beds, we have 15 Safe Havens, and Safe Havens are a semi-private kind of nook or kind of like a cubicle is what we have going on over here. And they're big enough just for a bed or a wardrobe. And these Safe Havens are even lower barrier in a sense because, those clients do not have to be back for any sort of curfew. They can be away multiple days without losing their bed. But the folks that end up in there are very vulnerable individuals. And we see it as a good jumping point for those folks. Rather than the end of homelessness, we still are very much actively working on housing and trying to get them out of the shelter. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is Stephanie from Anti-Trafficking Services, and we have relied on numerous shelters, not just Florence House, which is run under the same organization that we are under, Preble Street, but also our city shelters and a variety of specialized shelters, which we all took a look at in the poll. But in our relationship with Florence House, we found that utilizing a shelter can sometimes be the best choice for an immediate solution. And it allows us to be able to address some of those underlying challenges that may need to be addressed first before we can go into long-term solutions. So I can give you a couple of examples. One that even occurred this past weekend where, we get an emergency referral of someone like a couple hours out of trafficking, and we can call Florence House because of our relationship with them and there's one emergency safe haven that is held specifically for our program, and we can make sure that person has a bed for the night, even though that person experienced a high level of re-traumatization and found some of the things around the shelter to be triggering for her. It still was a way for her to move out of her situation. And then we could come up the next morning with a better sustainable plan, which is essentially what happened. Or we've had clients that have had some serious physical health issues that it was best for them to be in the shelter before we could house them, or before even like using a hotel or something. Because of their health issues, they needed that 24-hour presence of someone. And in those cases, it was really important that there was someone on the desk 24 hours, because there were times when the ambulance did need to be called, and that client couldn't call for themselves because they didn't speak English and they didn't necessarily understand the structure of how to get help. I think we've talked a bunch about trauma-informed practices. Amy talked a lot about that, but I will say one thing we've also seen to be important is that the Florence House staff has allowed our clients to build some trust and allegiance with another set of providers that aren't necessarily anti-trafficking, and that has really provided a stabilizing system for clients. And yeah, and the low barrier and housing first model is so important when we're working with survivors of trafficking, because our goal is always, right, we want to empower our clients to take back control and power over their lives, and to process through their healing. And housing first and low barrier does that without stigmatizing or penalizing people who may be engaging in, you know, what we might deem as risky behavior, whether they are engaging in sex work or whether they're engaging in substance use or self-harm, that they're still able to access housing without any kind of stigmatization. Next slide. I was going to say, just as Amy mentioned in the beginning in her section about going out and having coffee with people, and that being a strong foundation to building relationships with shelters, that I'm going to say over and over again, what makes our relationship successful with Florence House and with other shelters is the constant communication. And it can look like coming in and training, and we have done numerous trainings for Florence House staff, not just on anti-trafficking and human trafficking, but also on trauma-informed practices with people who have experienced numerous levels of violence in their life. But we also used to be housed in there. Our office used to be in the basement, and that was really helpful to build a relationship when we have a physical presence there. Beth, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I also think, as you know, mentioned earlier, not everyone self-identifies. I really am grateful for the trainings ATS has provided our staff, because they now have red flags and all of that on their radar when they're doing intakes with our new clients. And sometimes things come up that have our staff go, oh, that doesn't sound right, and they'll reach out to Stephanie or one of her staff, and then that client gets connected, and it's a really beautiful thing.
We've actually had just a recent client that happened that night, of like a client comes in for a one night bed and has an intake with a caseworker, and the caseworker identifies that this person has definitely experienced very recent human trafficking, and she emails us, and we talk that night, and then we have a caseworker there the very next morning to support her around her needs and to address some of the safety concerns, because that is always an issue for us, and something that we try and understand, that Florence House has certain boundaries around what level of safety they can provide, but I feel like we've done an excellent job at collaborating on working what they can provide for that. I'd also say that it really has helped for casework. Florence has a housing specialist, as well as a couple of caseworkers who are very adept at navigating the housing system. So we know when we have a client who is in Florence House that we can rely on them to handle the housing search, which can be really long, or the voucher application, which can be a lot of work, so that our caseworkers can work on some of the other needs and provide some other services. And I talked a little bit about the extra coverage, that for certain clients, it's really important, especially if someone has a high level of use, or might be in danger of overdosing, or has health issues, or has some mental health issues, for them to be an environment that has 24-hour coverage, just until we can address and stabilize a little bit more.
Great. Next slide. Oh. Whatever.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Beth and Stephanie. That was extremely useful. And we're really excited to hear just how the Preble Street has been able, and Florence House has been able to really adapt that housing first approach. And we definitely hear, the anxiety and challenges that could arise. And also through the work that we've been doing with survivors and with obviously partners in the anti-trafficking field and in the housing and homeless world, we've seen that there is that shift to really make services low barrier and to allow easy access, because we do know that as people face, individuals, as they face housing instability or experience homelessness, it heightens their vulnerability, and that can obviously impact human trafficking, or it could re-trigger, another episode of human trafficking. And so as people are more vulnerable, it's more likely that they'll experience some sort of exploitation or victimization. And so that's really the idea behind making sure that services are readily available, that they don't have to meet certain requirements or be, in order to access housing. And that's what we mean by, that housing first approach, that low barrier access, or also just a human rights-based approach to housing. So now we're going to hear from Swamir's. He's going to be he's from the IRC in Seattle, and he'll be talking about the practical ways that they've been able to develop a very useful relationship with their local homeless shelter in order to provide wraparound services.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. This is Swamir Scarino for the International Rescue Committee in Seattle with the Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network. About a year and 4 months ago, I took over the leadership of the program, and we were really looking at being strategic, being resource-oriented, and really looking at ways that we can partner with the private and nonprofit sector to ensure that all the needs of survivors are met through a system, a coordinated effort to ensure that all of their needs are met through our program or to our partners in the community. The first thing we did was do an assessment with all of our advocates and all of the people that we serve every day to ensure that we're focusing on the right resources and the right needs for the people we serve every day. Of course, the biggest need was housing, but not only short-term housing, but also long-term housing that looked very specific at the needs of the people. That looked at their people's capacity to cope with life, mental illness, looked at substance misuse and abuse, and many other facets of a person's recovery. And using perhaps the principle of care in a trauma-informed and person-centered approach, and perhaps to quote one of my what I would like to call her a mentor, which is Amy Flauschauer from the International Institute of Buffalo. One of the things I learned from her is that as a service provider, we should be the experts on resources, and our clients are the experts in our lives. So we have really taken that to heart, really to understand that we are here to provide as many options so our clients can make an informed decision using their own autonomy and self-governance, and really make an informed decision on where do they want to go. So temporary housing or emergency housing has been one of our top priorities, given that nearly 80% of our caseload comes with a housing need, either a temporary housing or long-term housing, or are in transition from emergency housing to long-term housing. So there's a lot there to unpack. So taking that principle, we are the experts on resources, we really saw our jobs on making sure we were able to offer as many options to people as possible. So these shelters, we wanted to make sure that we had as many options for people with families, documented, undocumented, immigrants, U.S. citizens, and we really looked at all of our network and our community. What we saw is that there was already a shelter for women. There was no shelter for men, only one specific shelter for human trafficking, sex trafficking survivors, but not labor trafficking. And so there was a lot of gaps there. So what we started doing was being very strategic on the way that we set out our partners, the way that we engage our partners. And during this process that we're going through this revitalization, perhaps, of our reach and efforts, the Salvation Army in Seattle reached out because they had identified a need for training to understand the complexities of human trafficking. So instead of doing it over the phone or sending them literature for them to read, what we did is to set up a meeting with them. We talked about human trafficking. We talked about the necessities for to ensure that victims of human trafficking and survivors of trafficking to receive the services they need, to receive a trauma-informed, person-centered approach. But before I went to that meeting, I did my research on the Salvation Army. I have known of them. I know what they do, but I didn't know specifically their mission. So what I wanted to come in prepared with them to ensure that I know what they stand for. So I went and to the website and saw their mission, and I wanted to find an area of interest, and they spelled it out for me right away. So the mission of the Salvation Army is into one mission into the world of hurting, broken, lonely, disposed, and lost, reaching them in love by all means. Which was like, that's beautiful. And then we looked into the different areas that they focus, and we found our area of interest. It stands for and serve the marginalized. And even though that is a lot of language there, and perhaps the language was not the best or trauma-informed when it comes to that, we had that area of interest. And my job was to reframe it to them in a way that that it makes sense to the people that we serve. It makes sense to the needs of survivors, a need for a trauma-informed approach, a need for so much more. But we also discuss all the different complexities of the people that we serve, being from, we are currently serving people from 45 different countries, people from literally to speak 27 unique languages. And so we have a large profile of people, U.S. citizens, foreign nationals, people who may identify as LGBTQ, trans, or whatever that looks like. And during that conversation, the face-to-face meeting, what we agreed on is that, we had something they need, and we asked them for the opportunity to continue having a conversation on how we can open up an opportunity for survivors of trafficking to access emergency housing or housing or shelter placement, perhaps for a period of time, while the advocates at the War Network are looking to secure long-term stable housing. So with that in mind, looking at the mission, we went back to the Salvation Army and continued having conversations on creating the partnership. Of course, we talked about a trauma-informed approach. We talked about our concerns that we had. We talked about working with people who are U.S. citizens or immigrants or undocumented immigrants, the challenges of securing housing, and so on and so on. And what we really took the hook, it was the fact that we had a very specific area of interest, a common area of interest. And the fact that I was prepared to let them know that our interests at WARN and the International Rescue Committee are similar to the interests that they had when serving very specific people, we wanted to ensure that they knew that, and that we had some commonalities perhaps on the way that we wanted to work together. So we set up a meeting, and they looked very specific at the people we serve. So we talked about folks who are documented, folks who identify as LGBTQ, and so much more. And during this process, a lot of our concerns kind of went away, right? Given that, so the Salvation Army in Seattle, they do have a female and male shelter. However, a person can go into the female shelter if they identify as female, if they can go to a male shelter if they identify as male. So it could be a trans person who identifies as female, they can be placed at the female shelter. If we have a trans person who identifies as male, they can go into the male shelter, or vice versa. So we really looked at all of those different issues to address all of the complexities that the people we serve experience. And so we continue to find those areas, and we also discussed with them what were their concerns as far as opening up their doors to serve survivors of trafficking who meet the standards, who meet perhaps the eligibility to be placed at the shelter, or to have access to a shelter. One of the big things that came up to them, it was, how it must be really dangerous to serve survivors of trafficking. And being a domestic violence program, we already deal with too much danger. And the reality is that, serving survivors of trafficking, it is as well as serving survivors of domestic violence. When it comes to the same issues, the same power dynamics, the same control dynamics, you will find there's some similarities in there. So we put this in perspective and in contrast to let them know that the reality is that, yes, working with human trafficking survivors, it requires some type of a specialization, but at the same time, it will allow us to, they're still the people who need services, and it still fits within their mission. So if we move on to the next slide, we continue to have this conversation. We taught them about these concerns they had on dangers. We talked about possible recruitment happening in there, and we really came out with a lot of agreements. That, of course, training, not only to understand human trafficking, but also to train all their staff on trauma-informed. How is it to create a trauma-informed program? How is it to have to live up to the trauma-informed concept and perhaps basis, and being a person-centered programming. So we provided a lot of education. This partnership was not created overnight. It took a lot of really both the Salvation Army and the WARM program coming together and really talking out and sharing information. And at the end of the day, what we figured out is that it is the same complexity that you see in some domestic violence cases are the same complexities that you see in human trafficking. Of course, they all have their own specific set of vulnerabilities and perhaps other issues they may have experienced. However, there were a lot of similarities in there. So we really looked at providing a lot of education, a lot of training. We had that here. It was great for them to get that. And also the realities of human trafficking. They thought that human trafficking was this very scary thing. It is a very scary thing. However, with setting up a process or setting up a really good, robust case management system, it really looks at removing some of the potential dangers. We create a safety plan with each person. We provide all options. We provide all information to not only Salvation Army, but also to our clients, so they can again really look at finding ways that that they can put to rest some of those concerns they had. So then we looked at addressing some of the more very specific concerns of survivors of trafficking. We looked at gender issues. We looked at realities of labor and sex trafficking, what that looks like. We looked at language issues. We looked at cultural issues. We looked at age appropriateness and so much more. The reality is that during this process, yes, there was a lot of give and take and a lot of process, but what we decided that this is not a long-term, this is using a shelter or homeless shelter is a short-term solution for a long-term problem. So using these resources it should only be a temporary basis, with the goal that within 1 to 3 months we will be helping that person transition from the emergency shelter, the homeless shelter, into long-term and stable housing, which itself poses a different challenge, given we are such a big city, with so much, so many big businesses bringing more people and creating a housing problem. However, having that option for people so they can choose in an informed way whether if they want to go into that shelter or not, that was amazing. And people really, we had so many concerns given that our clients were not going to take these opportunities or we're not going to use them, whatever that looks like. And a lot of our clients have used that opportunity to work on themselves, to really take this time and really create that opportunity for themselves and work with us to ensure that we find long-term housing solutions for them. So part of this agreement with the Salvation Army was a lot of looking at outreach, how we're going to do outreach for the communities, what type of partnership we're going to have, and so much more. This with a lot of relationships with homeless shelters or housing providers in general. It's a lot of like we give, they give, and that is what is a mutual collaboration, that give and take, right? It's the perfect relationship on which they need something, we have it, we let them know the realities of the needs of trafficking survivors, they find a way to meet those needs and so much more. And the end goal of all of these relationships and of all this work, it was to ensure that survivors, that we can serve survivors of trafficking the best possible way, that there are short-term housing opportunities for survivors, and create those meaningful ways that people can engage with trafficking survivors without the fears, without that, the extra stuff that, without the proper education, people would be so afraid, perhaps in a way to say that, of engaging with survivors of trauma and so much more. We really leverage our organization's resources and expertise. What we mean by that is that a final agreement with the Salvation Army was that they will provide the housing, meals, and kind of like the day-to-day living situations for our clients, and we'll provide all case management. So we had that give and take. And then we also came back with the specific forms. As you know, some of the homeless shelters have to do some specific intakes mandated by HUD or so much more. And what we did is that we also created some very specific forms with the consent of our clients. We let them know that if they took on this opportunity to go to this shelter, we're going to be we're going to be sharing some information with them to ensure that their intake process at the Salvation Army was a lot faster, was smoother, was trauma-informed, was person-centered, and we cut down a lot of the paperwork to ensure that a lot of information that we have, we provide that to them. And then the Salvation Army went even above and beyond with that. They even heard our concerns about using homeless shelters. We said to them, usually our clients, people have experienced a lot of trauma. Being in a big open space with so many other people could be re-traumatizing, having this space, and so much more. We looked at substance abuse and so much more there. The Salvation Army went above and beyond, and here our concerns are said, well, we have rooms, we have this space. So at the female shelter, one room, there's 3 people in that room that have bunk beds, and then at the male shelter, they did the same thing. They have their own room. It's one big room with 3 bunk beds and their own bathroom. We don't want to say that they give us a special treatment, but they really, really hurt us when it comes to the needs of the people that we're serving, the trauma-related needs people have, and kind of like how trafficking it's almost. It takes away the privacy of people and why that was important to have their own space and so much more. So that give and take in education resulted in best and perhaps more trauma-informed accommodations for our clients and so much more. So that was just amazing for us to see how that relationship created that sustainable way for us to create that system of sending clients over for them to be served for housing-related needs at the Salvation Army. And we're extremely confident that the Salvation Army is providing the best housing solution opportunities for people. They have in our information sharing form with the Salvation Army, we let them know what are the cultural and linguistic needs of our clients, what are their religion and dietary needs of our clients. If they're able to accommodate those, they will be accommodated. If they're not, we find other solutions for them for those dietary needs to be accommodated. And that was just amazing for them to be so open to look at halal foods. We looked at vegetarian food. We looked at very specific type of dietary concerns people had, and we were able to meet those. And again, in that give and take type of relationship to ensure that our clients had the best possible experience at a homeless shelter. And again, to our surprise, a lot more people took on this opportunity to have this place while we're working with them to access long-term and sustainable housing. Do I have a next slide on this?
I believe that is it.
Okay, great. So it is. So for us, this is strategic collaboration, being very centered to the needs of the people. We did our own survey with the people we serve. We did our survey with the advocates. We heard the advocates' concern. We heard them. We had so many different conversations with them. Like I said, trauma-informed services or trauma-informed model is not an easy process. It's not an overnight process, but we really took our time to develop a meaningful relationship that looked at every concern that the people that we serve had, all the concerns that our advocates had, and created a great sustainable solution for emergency housing for our clients. And the best part about this is that since over the last 6-8 months, this relationship has continued to flourish and really looked at a lot of needs and a lot of people using these resources, it led for the Salvation Army to apply for very specific funding to increase their capacity, to assign, to have grant-funded beds specifically for labor trafficking survivors. So now we have through this partnership, we have six emergency housing or shelter beds at the Salvation Army, 3 for female, 3 for male labor trafficking survivors, and then we had other beds specifically for people who have experienced sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. So that partnership led for them to create this very great, sustainable, and trauma-informed system that allowed them to expand to receive additional funding and create labor trafficking specific beds for our clients. So this is how a successful collaboration really looks like when it comes to housing solutions and utilizing homeless shelter. That is all I have prepared for you all. I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Great, thank you, Samirs. We want to thank all of our panelists for being able to just share from their expertise, from their experience as to how they've been able to really tackle and work to provide those connections with the homeless and housing world, especially in homeless shelters. We want to acknowledge that this is a 1.5 hour webinar. We've been able to hear from the presenters and we'll be moving on to questions. And that is also a very limited time. So we know that there are a lot of practices that we may not even be aware about that are really working in your community, and we want to hear about them. So please continue to use the chat and make us aware of, if there's something that's been useful for you or something that has been really working in your community. There have been a number of participants who have shared kind of what they're doing, and it's been really useful, not just on our side, but I think for all participants to hear and get some ideas of how to start bridging that gap. We also want to acknowledge that this is hard work on both ends, on people who are working in shelters, in that staff, and trying to continuously make that a safe space for those residents, and also for people in the anti-trafficking world who are trying to connect survivors to resources. And sometimes we don't connect as well as we hope we do. And our intention is to really start bridging that gap, because for survivors of trafficking who are experiencing homelessness, although they are survivors of trafficking, they are experiencing homelessness and are eligible for those services. And also shelters are very likely, like our panelists mentioned, already serving survivors of trafficking, whether they know it or not. And so as we start to work together and bridge kind of those resources, we can support each other, so that way it's not, it doesn't feel like a burden on one system or the other, but more so as a collaboration where we're all bringing our resources and our expertise to really address holistically the needs of those individuals and really meeting that end goal. So to that end, we're going to go ahead and start with some questions. I know that there were a number of questions that were submitted, both in the registration link and in the chat box. So one of the questions that came up was around red flags for human trafficking. So what do those flags look like? We'll go ahead and start with Amy, and she'll talk about that.
Hi, thanks, Karen. So I just want to review a couple of quick flags that might show up when you are working with someone. You might see signs of abuse or malnourishment or extreme fear. You might see, or you might hear that someone hasn't been paid or paid very little for the work that they've been doing. They're working excessive hours, or perhaps they're working under dangerous conditions. They may not have access to their identification They may not know what city they're in, or when they arrived in the city that they're in. So those are a few. However, and this is a huge however, there's a lot of misconceptions out there and kind of generalizations about what a red flag for trafficking is. So we recently got a call, for example, from a CPS worker who said, I'm working with a kid and their fingernails are really long and they've been manicured regularly, and she has her own cell phone. This was a kid that was 16 years old. So I bring this example up because we work with, and I know in my personal life, a lot of 16-year-olds that would qualify for. And so, however, and I think that this is something I just want to speak to all of the trafficking specific programs on the line right now, just as my colleagues from Preble Street were talking about low barrier access to housing, we really have a culture here at the Institute of having low barrier to any referral. Whenever we do training, we always review red flags, we always review risk assessment, we give as thorough a training as we can, and we end that with, you don't need to retain any of what we just told you. If you have any question about whether or not someone's trafficked, please call us, please call us. That's what we are experts in. And I just think that that's really important, because any potential referral or tip that we receive is an opportunity to create collaboration with a community partner. It's an opportunity to hear why they think this person might be trafficked, and can we talk that through? And of course, we make sure that without signed consent, they're not sharing any personal identifying information with us, but certainly we can talk through why they made that call and some next steps that they might be able to take in order to see if that referral is appropriate. So I just think that I've talked to a lot of programs again across the country who feel like they need to know that trafficking has happened, because whenever they call their local trafficking program, they're just met with so many questions that they haven't yet asked, nor do they feel like they're not qualified to ask those clients the questions in a trauma-informed way. And so I would just suggest that another opportunity for collaboration and relationship building is to sit down with your partner organizations and say, what are some of the questions we might be able to add to our intake form? Or when is it appropriate? Or can we have anonymous case conferencing where we don't talk about anything specific, but in fact talk about tips that we've received and how some have really led to proper identification. Thanks, Karen.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is for swimmers, and of course other panelists are also welcome to join in. And the question is around safety. So for homeless shelters, what sort of steps can they take in order to ensure safety for survivors of human trafficking, especially when they are not a trafficking specific shelter, so they may have more access, or other people in the general public may have access to that shelter. So what are some areas that they can think about as far as safety for survivors?
And I think when it comes to this relationship that we have the Salvation Army, when we looked at safety, we really looked at very doing safety planning with our clients. We believe that the Salvation Army had very specific systems of checking in and checking out when it came to being able to go in and out and all that kind of good stuff. But it was mostly for us, when it comes to safety, we really did safety planning with our clients to also ensure that if we offer people a homeless shelter solution for their housing situation, we looked at where their trafficking experience happened, how if this place will be easily accessible by a trafficker, if the trafficker is actively looking for them, and so much more. So we did look at a very specific at the trafficking situations of each of the clients, and if the housing of, if the shelter was the most appropriate one, we also we did all the steps to ensure their physical safety and their own psychological safety. But then the safety planning that I recommend and that actually has worked really well for us is actually for our client, really, to keep themselves safe, making sure that whenever, how they use public transportation, if they use Facebook, to remove the location. We also looked at psychological safety, what type of contact that person needs. So the person is currently seeing an advocate or a clinician. How do they access that? How do they use the cell phone or the phone within the shelter, and all that good stuff. So all of our clients go to the shelter with their own cell phone or their own. We were fortunate to receive a large national cell phone, so each of our clients who go into a shelter have their own method of communication, and that they don't need to rely upon the shelter for communication. So to be honest, we looked at safety in a different perspective, not necessarily as the place itself being a secure facility. We were not looking for that at all. We're looking for our clients to have as much as autonomy and self-governance as possible, for them to, if they are undocumented or newly arrived, they're not fully comprehend how to ride the bus and stuff like that. All of those were parts of safety, but also were parts of our case management aspect. So that was a long answer for that question, but for a lack of better work, I want to challenge you all to look at safety at a more individualized thing, to ensure that people are keeping themselves safe, are also making sure that the location where the shelter is at is also safe for our clients. We will not even bring it up if we know that where the shelter is located is nearby or nearby the location where the trafficking situation happened. So we were very strategic around that and how to safety plan with our clients.
Thank you, Samirs. The next question is going to be for Beth, and it's about how do you, as a shelter, what steps can you take to help survivors feel welcome, especially in an environment that may not be completely separate or that may have more group housing?
Yeah, I think it just starts right in the beginning. Our staff are extra mindful when doing intakes, and I feel like also just the collaboration piece with Stephanie and her team, having the dual support there, and just that awareness of this might be the first time this client has never been homeless, right? And it's a major culture shock. So Stephanie, do you have anything to add, being on the other end, like working directly with those clients, their experience?
Sure.
Example, maybe?
I think Samirs really has highlighted the importance of making sure that clients have as much information as possible and as much information about their choices. So when we go through the available choices for shelter, especially emergency shelter, we really try and make it as clear as possible as to what is going to happen inside the shelter and what does it look like. And that is really important for, as Beth mentioned, our clients who have never been in a shelter before, to kind of walk them through what it looks like, what the expectations are, when are lights in, lights out, do they have to check in at a certain time, and then who are their go-to. Also, I think when talking about welcoming, Florence House is a women's only shelter. And it's important to note that they do have male staff and they do have male caseworkers. And for some clients, that can be challenging depending on their previous level of violence and who perhaps was trafficking them. And that is something we do also talk to our clients about, just to make them aware that this is happening. And also we talk to the Florence House staff. If the client feels that it is okay, that we can all sit down together and share certain things around their safety and around their safety in the space, even with other caseworkers. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is for Amy. And there have been actually a number of questions talking about how do you address or try to prevent recruitment within shelter. So especially for shelters that may not be human trafficking specific, who want to support and want to house survivors of human trafficking. How do you address those concerns that could lead to potentially recruitment within the shelter?
Sure. So I just want to say that I think that this is a tough one, and I'm going to go back to a solution that's grounded in communication and transparency, both between our program and the community shelter programs we work with, but also between us and the survivors that we work with. One of the things that we think about often here at the Institute is that the clients we refer to shelter can also be exposed to a number of things that they haven't been exposed to before, right? When people are living together, sometimes there is recruitment perhaps into trafficking, there is introduction of a new drug, there is to someone, there is a encouragement to go back to an abuser or negativity about someone. So I think a lot of negative influence can come when you're working with vulnerable and survivors of poly-victimization that's often gone untreated. And I guess I would also say that the opposite is true. And so we really try to stay grounded in a strengths-based perspective. We talk to survivors about that and that expectation, walking into whatever service that we're referring to. And we try to be clear about those expectations and have that same message. So for example, if we often bring it back to safety, and we try not to make it only about trafficking, because again, that can really isolate someone or stigmatize the survivors that we're working with. But what kinds of, for instance, values are shared with residents and the expectations for residents in various shelters around safety and looking out for each other, and reporting or asking for help when they see different issues within the shelter. And one of those could be recruiting. So I think that thinking about recruitment in kind of the larger context of safety planning and being part of a community that can ensure safety, or at least promote safety amongst its residents, is an important philosophical place to start, and then walking through together with, of course, survivor input about what that can look like.
Thank you, Amy. The next question, I think people were really impressed and interested in the model that IRC in Seattle has taken in order to establish that relationship that's collaborative with the Salvation Army. And so we've gotten a number of questions on how shelters can begin to take those steps in order to identify anti-trafficking organizations to partner with. So what are some of those steps that they can take, or where can they look in order to find someone that they can partner with to, again, provide that holistic approach and support to survivors? So Swamir?
Thank you, Karen. I think that is a great question. And I think honestly, I think when it comes to a shelter, they have to be their own. They have to analyze their own capacity, their own ability to do this, their own willingness to the give and take approach, right? Like that collaboration, we give, they give, and for the outcome of serving a population who needs this solution for a long-term problem. So I think the shelter really first has to, assimilate their own capacity, their own abilities, their own scope of work, and their own mission, whether this fits within their goal of serving people who have experienced some type of civil rights violation, just for lack of a better word there. And from there, really to be very strategic on their own capacity. Again, with the Salvation Army, what they looked at is like, okay, we can provide the housing part of these and provide the accommodation, but we do not have the capacity to provide intensive case management. And that is when we said, okay, we can provide the case management. I mean, all of the, we are already working with people. We already have, they're already enrolled in our program by that time, and already been assigned a case manager by the time we refer them to the Salvation Army for them to provide accommodations. So that type of give and take. So I think the shelter has to experience their own, they have to understand their own capacity. Then they have to be very perhaps strategic on who they're reaching out to, and to have their own list of kind of like what they are able to give and what they're seeking out as part of their partnership. And this goes from either a service provider looking for a shelter to partner, or for a shelter to look for a service provider to partner up with. So really both of those parties should be looking at their own capacity, their own ability to that give and take and that collaboration, and their own ability to serve people in a trauma-informed, person-centered, culturally, linguistically, and age-appropriate. Those are I would say the 6 important things that you need to look at when providing that give and take and that mutual collaboration. So, and from there, really, again, doing your own research on who are the partners in the community, who are the people doing these services. Can they take on this partnership? Can they manage this partnership? Can they afford to be, to the trauma-informed and to a lot of negotiations? Because all of those are the things that we need to look at. And it really, really, really worked well with both organizations who are interested in serving a population that was really much in need. But again, I'm going to say this many times, is that each organization should acknowledge their own capacity and their own will to the give and take relationship, and to perhaps even sometimes to compromise, so provide really important education while not compromising the care and the approach that you take when it comes to serving the people you serve. So there's a compromise, but the compromisation should not be on the level of care. It should be on the relationship building, or perhaps your advocates doing a little more work when it comes to filling out additional documentation to send to the Salvation Army to place somebody at their shelter, stuff like that. Those are the things you can compromise, and I don't think we can. But not at all. We should be compromising the care for the people we serve.
Great. Thank you so much, Samirs. There were a number of questions that came in about using the HMIS system. And for those in the anti-trafficking world, that's the system that is utilized by the homeless and housing world in order to provide a coordinated entry for individuals who are seeking services, and especially shelter. So although that is a whole other conversation, we just wanted to highlight that for victim service providers, which includes domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking service providers, they are not allowed, they are prohibited actually by VAWA and FIBSA from entering information of a survivor into that system. That doesn't necessarily exclude their ability to collaborate. It just means that they need to have a comparable system in which they can provide some information, so that way you can, as the shelter, you can still provide services. The best way to address that issue is to begin with those collaborations, just like it's been mentioned with Samirs and with our other panelists. It really takes developing that relationship, whether starting off with coffee or whatever it looks like in your local area, in order to address some of those issues or those potential tensions. We want to make sure that a system does not exclude survivors from receiving services. So we want to just make sure that everyone's familiar with that. And although that is a broader conversation that we will definitely make sure that we address in future webinars, just to let you know what limitations exist there. It looks like we're about at time. So we're going to go ahead and close up with just one more question. The last question is for Amy, and it's about confidentiality. So and I know you talked a little bit about this, but do you have some recommendations for service providers in the anti-trafficking field of what steps they can take in order to maintain that confidentiality when they're referring to a homeless shelter, and vice versa. Also, for if a homeless shelter were to come across a survivor who self-identifies, what are some ways that they can ensure that that confidentiality is intact and that it protects the survivor?
Right. So Karen, I assume that this question is about not wanting to stigmatize a survivor of trafficking as such when they're being referred.
Correct.
Yep. And so I think, so again, I feel like I'm saying the same thing, but this is something, it's a great question. And again, something that should be addressed in those preliminary conversations. And again, transparently with survivors. I'm laughing because I'm recalling a situation where a survivor told us after we were kind of going back and forth, like, I don't care if you identified me as a trafficking survivor, because we were making sure that, you know, we weren't seen as the referring agency, because then there would be stigma. So again, having that transparent conversation with the survivor is really important. And then again, just figuring out sometimes with survivors' input, of course, how you can maintain that confidentiality. And so we go through the same referral process as any other program, unless we feel like there is a special issue that would bump up someone's ability to be able to access shelter more quickly. But what we want to do is work with shelters who will ask about any one needing services. What kinds of accommodations might you need, whether they be the many things that Samir's pointed out, whether they be around meals or dietary restrictions or the triggers that they might have. It's interesting. I'm also recalling another conversation where the shelter started learning more and more about trauma-informed care because of some of the things that we were bringing up, and made the realization of like, well, we should be asking anyone who comes in if they know their own triggers and how we can accommodate that. So again, I think that making a big picture is important, and not seeing it necessarily as a trafficking specific situation, but rather how do we maintain confidentiality and avoid stigmatization no matter who comes in our shelter, because we know obviously that vulnerable populations can have a number of challenges that could result in being stigmatized. And so just bringing that up to a larger big picture question, I think can be really helpful in making all referral and accommodation policies more trauma informed and client-centered.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was extremely useful. And thank you all to all the participants who have been active. The chat has been very active, which we really appreciate. I know that there were a lot of questions that we didn't get an opportunity to get to. So what we'll do on our end is we'll plan on putting an FAQ together based on this conversation, on questions that were received and comments that were received throughout this webinar, as well as additional questions that came in on the registration link. As you saw, there were a number of links that were shared, so please feel free to look at those. There are a number of resources that you can all visit. Most of those were from our website on freedomnetworkusa.org. We have like I mentioned, a housing project that is specifically for survivors of human trafficking and to support service providers in addressing that access. We have a resource library, and of course, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to connect with you and hear more about the projects and programs that are working well in your area or challenges that you're having. We definitely want to keep connected with you. And we will be sending out an email in the next week with the recording of this webinar, as well as with the slides. And if you have any questions that we can answer for you, or that you're still curious about, please let us know. Like I mentioned, we did get a lot of activity in the chat box, so we know that there's a lot of interest on this topic, and also that this is one of, for us, the first webinar specifically addressing this bridge or this collaboration, and that there is a lot more for us to do. So just know that there will be additional resources and discussions around this topic, and we want to hear from you. Thank you all again. You will be seeing a link for a survey on the chat box. Please go ahead and fill that out. It would be really useful to know if this webinar met your expectations, what we can do better, how we can best deliver it, so that way it's useful for you, and it can be helpful for everyone in the field. Thank you again, and you can go ahead and disconnect after you take your survey.